The scream came before the doctor did. Alara Ashworth was still in her riding coat when they carried her husband through the front doors of Dunmarch Hall, his body limp across the arms of two grooms, his face the color of old candle wax. Blood had soaked through the shoulder of his coat and dried along his jaw. She did not scream. She had never been a woman who screamed. She simply stood at the bottom of the staircase with her hand pressed flat against the banister, watching the man she had married 3 years ago being carried past her like a piece of broken furniture. "He struck his head on the stone wall by the lower field," said one of the grooms, a young man named Peter Dell, his voice shaking. "The horse threw him clean over the fence, Your Grace. He has not opened his eyes since." Alara followed them up the stairs, her skirts gathered in one fist, her heart slamming against her ribs. She did not cry. Crying would come later, if it came at all. Right now she needed to see his chest rise and fall. Needed proof that Edmund, Duke of Dunmarch, was still breathing. He was. Barely. Dr. Alden Rook arrived within the hour, his bag rattling with instruments, his face already arranged into the careful blankness of a man who did not yet know what he would find. Alara was not permitted in the room while he examined her husband. She stood outside the door with her palms pressed against the wood, straining to hear anything beyond the low murmur of the doctor's voice and the creak of the mattress. When the door finally opened, Dr. Rook looked older than he had that morning. "He is alive," he said. "His skull is not broken, which is a mercy, but there is a swelling behind his eyes that concerns me greatly. He may wake in an hour. He may wake in a week. I cannot say whether he will wake as the man you married, Your Grace, or as someone else entirely." Alara nodded slowly, forcing her voice to stay even. "I want to see him." "Of course." Edmund lay still beneath the heavy blankets, his dark hair damp against his forehead, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow but steady. Alara sat beside the bed and took his hand. It was warm. That, at least, was something. She stayed there through the night, refusing food, refusing sleep, refusing every offer of comfort from the maids who came and went with candles and cold cloths. It was near dawn when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside, low voices that did not belong to servants. She recognized one of them at once. Percival Hale, her husband's cousin, the man who stood to inherit Dunmarch if Edmund died without an heir, since Alara had borne him no children in 3 years of marriage. Percival had arrived from London within a day of the accident, which struck Alara as remarkable, given that London was 2 days' hard ride from Dunmarch. She said nothing of this to anyone. She only listened. "Matter of guardianship, surely. If he cannot manage his own affairs," Percival was saying, his voice pitched low but not low enough. "The physician says he may never wake fully himself again. Someone must run this estate, Cassandra. It cannot simply sit untended." "And that someone should be you," came the reply. A woman's voice, cool and certain. Lady Cassandra Hale, Percival's wife, a woman Alara had always found difficult to read. Her smile too practiced, her eyes too watchful. "You are his nearest male relation. The law favors you already. All you need is a physician willing to say the right words on paper." Alara stood very still in the dark hallway, her back against the cold stone wall, her hand still faintly warm from her husband's fingers. She had heard enough. She did not confront them, not yet. She was not a fool, and she understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that a grieving duchess with no proof and no allies would be dismissed as hysterical, as unreliable, as a woman clinging to false hope. She needed to be smarter than that. She needed to watch. So she returned to her husband's bedside and sat with him until the sun rose, and when Percival came to inquire after the Duke's condition with an expression of practiced sorrow, Alara thanked him for his concern and said nothing else at all. By the third day, Percival had begun giving orders to the household staff as though he already owned the house. He instructed the head groom to sell 2 of the carriage horses, claiming the stables were an unnecessary expense during a time of crisis. He told the cook to reduce the household budget by 1/3. He moved into the East Wing guest chambers, the largest and finest in the house apart from the master suite, and had his trunks unpacked as though he intended to stay for a very long time. Alara watched all of this with a calm face and a burning mind. She said nothing to stop him, not directly. Instead, she went to Simon Fairweather, the estate steward, a quiet man who had served the Ashworth family for over 20 years and had known Edmund since he was a boy. "Mr. Fairweather," she said, finding him alone in the estate office, bent over the ledgers by candlelight. "I would like the account books for the last 12 months, all of them, and I would like you to tell no one that I asked for them." Fairweather looked up at her, his expression unreadable for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "Your Grace, I have wondered when someone would ask." "What do you mean?" He hesitated, glancing toward the door as though he expected someone to be listening. "There have been small irregularities, my lady, sums that do not quite match. Requests from Lord Hale that I was told came directly from the Duke, though I confess I never heard His Grace give such instructions myself, not before the accident." Alara felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Show me." They worked through the night by candlelight, poring over columns of figures, and what Alara found made her hands go still over the page. Money had been moved, not enough to be obvious at a glance, but enough, over months, to suggest a pattern. Percival had been quietly draining funds from the estate accounts long before the accident had ever happened, funneling them into accounts Fairweather did not recognize. "This did not begin 3 days ago," Alara said quietly. "No, my lady, I believe it did not." She closed the ledger and pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to think clearly through the exhaustion pulling at her body. If Percival had been stealing from the estate for months, then the accident, however it had truly happened, had handed him an opportunity he could not have hoped for. A Duke too injured to speak, and no one else with the authority to stop him. Upstairs, in the darkened bedroom, Edmund Ashworth lay motionless beneath the blankets, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and even. But his eyes were not always closed, not truly. In the hours when the house grew quiet and the candles burned low, and everyone believed him lost somewhere deep inside himself, Edmund had begun, faintly, to hear. Voices drifting through the walls, footsteps in the hallway. His cousin's voice, low and eager, speaking words that made something in his chest tighten with a fury he could not yet express, because his body would not yet obey him. He could not lift his hand, he could not open his eyes fully, could not speak, could not do anything but lie there and listen and understand, with growing horror, exactly what was happening around him, while the world believed him gone. He heard his wife's voice too, softer, steadier, sitting beside him night after night, telling him quietly about the weather, about the roses in the garden, about nothing important at all, simply so that the sound of something familiar might reach him wherever he had gone. He wanted, more than anything, to answer her. He could not. Not yet. On the 4th night, Dr. Rook returned to examine him again, and Alara stayed in the room while he worked, watching his hands, watching his face, watching for anything that might tell her more than his careful words ever would. "There has been a small change," Dr. Rook admitted, almost reluctantly. "His pupils respond more quickly to light than they did before. His pulse is stronger. I would not call it a full recovery, Your Grace, but it is not nothing. Then he might wake soon. He might, or he might remain as he is for a long while yet. I truly cannot say with certainty." Alara studied the doctor's face carefully. There was something behind his eyes, some hesitation he was not voicing, and she filed it away for later, the same way she had filed away Percival's whispered conversation in the hallway, the same way she had filed away the missing sums in Fairweather's ledgers. She was building something. She did not yet know what shape it would take, but she understood, with a clarity that steadied her exhausted mind, that she would need every piece of it before this was finished. That night, after the doctor had gone and the house had fallen silent, Alara sat once more beside her husband's bed and took his hand in both of hers. "I know what he is doing," she whispered, so quietly that only the walls could hear her. "I promise you, Edmund, I will not let him take what is yours. Whatever it costs me, I will not let him take it." In the bed, beneath the heavy blankets, in the dim and flickering candlelight, the Duke of Dunmarch's fingers moved. Only slightly, only for a moment, but they moved, and Alara, watching, felt her breath catch in her throat, and said nothing to anyone at all. Alara did not sleep that night either. She sat at the small writing desk in her chamber with Fairweather's ledgers spread before her, tracing the same suspicious entries again and again by candlelight, searching for a pattern she could take to someone who might actually believe her. A duchess accusing her husband's cousin of theft, with no witnesses and no proof beyond numbers she herself had gathered in secret, would be laughed out of any magistrate's office in the county. She needed more. She needed something no one could argue away. By morning, dark circles had settled beneath her eyes, but her mind was sharper than it had been in days. She dressed carefully, chose her calmest expression, and went down to breakfast as though nothing at all troubled her. Percival was already at the table, buttering toast with the easy comfort of a man who believed the house was already his. Cassandra sat beside him, sipping tea, watching Alara over the rim of her cup with an expression that was almost, but not quite, sympathetic. "You look tired, Your Grace," Cassandra said. "You really must rest. Grief takes a terrible toll on a woman's constitution." "I am not grieving," Alara said, taking her seat. My husband is alive. Of course he is, Percival said smoothly, not looking up from his toast. I only meant that the uncertainty must be exhausting. Not knowing whether he will wake, or in what condition, it would be exhausting for anyone. How fortunate, then, that Dr. Rook believes he is improving. Percival's knife paused for the briefest moment against his toast. It was such a small thing that Alara might have missed it entirely if she had not been watching for exactly that kind of reaction. He recovered quickly, smiling, setting the knife down. That is wonderful news, he said. Truly. I only worry, as any family member would, about what happens if the improvement does not continue. Someone must be prepared to manage the estate's affairs, Alara, whatever happens. It would be irresponsible not to plan for every outcome. How thoughtful of you to plan so far ahead, Alara said, and smiled, and said nothing more. After breakfast, she went to find Mrs. Winifred Combe, the housekeeper, a stout woman with sharp eyes who had run the household for nearly 15 years and who, Alara had begun to notice, always seemed to know exactly where Percival was and what he wanted before he asked for it. Mrs. Combe, Alara said, finding her in the linen room, counting sheets with brisk efficiency. I wanted to ask about the letters that arrive for Lord Hale. Do many come these days? Mrs. Comb's hands stilled on the linens for the briefest moment. A few, Your Grace. Business correspondence, I should think, though I could not say for certain what they contain. And do you deliver them to him yourself? I do, my lady. It has always been my habit to bring the post directly to guests staying in the house, rather than leaving it for the footman. There was nothing wrong with the answer. It was reasonable, even ordinary, and yet something in the housekeeper's tone, a careful evenness that matched too closely the careful evenness Percival himself used, made Alara's instincts prickle with suspicion. Thank you, Mrs. Combe. That will be all. She left the linen room with more questions than she had entered with, and spent the rest of the morning quietly watching the comings and goings of the house, noting who spoke to whom, who lingered in which corridors, who seemed always to know things they should not yet have known. It was Simon Fairweather who brought her the next piece of the puzzle, 2 days later, finding her alone in the small garden behind the east wing where she often walked to clear her thoughts. Your Grace, he said, glancing over his shoulder before speaking further. I believe I have found something you should see. He led her to the estate office and showed her a letter, half burned in the fireplace grate, that one of the maids had found while cleaning and, not knowing what it meant, had set aside without thinking to mention it to anyone but him. The letter was addressed to a solicitor in London. Most of it had burned away, but enough remained to make Alara's stomach turn cold. Regarding the transfer of guardianship, should the Duke's condition be confirmed as permanent by his physician, I trust you will proceed with the necessary documents at once. Dr. Rook has assured me. The rest was ash. Dr. Rook, Alara said quietly, staring at the scorched paper. He has assured Percival of something. But what, exactly, has he assured him of? I do not know, Your Grace, but I do not like the sound of it. Neither did Alara. That evening, she found an excuse to speak with Dr. Rook alone, catching him as he left her husband's bedroom after his evening examination. She led him into the small sitting room adjoining the master chambers and closed the door behind them. Dr. Rook, she said, keeping her voice gentle, careful. I must ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Has Lord Hale spoken to you about my husband's condition? About the possibility of declaring him permanently incapacitated? The doctor's face went pale. For a long moment he said nothing at all, and in that silence Alara found her answer more clearly than any words could have given it to her. Your Grace, I. Please, Alara said, and something in her voice must have carried more than she intended, because Dr. Rook's shoulders sagged, and the careful professional mask he wore slipped for just a moment, to reveal something tired and frightened underneath. He has offered me money, Dr. Rook admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. A great deal of money, Your Grace, to declare the Duke's condition permanent and irreversible, regardless of what I actually observe. He has hinted, more than once, that my continued position as the family physician for this county depends on my cooperation. I have refused him so far, but I will not pretend the pressure has not weighed on me. Alara felt something cold and clear settle over her, the last of her uncertainty burning away like morning fog under a rising sun. This was no longer suspicion. This was fact, spoken aloud by a man with everything to lose by admitting it. Will you help me stop him? She asked. Dr. Rook hesitated only a moment before nodding. I took an oath to do no harm, Your Grace. What Lord Hale is asking of me is nothing less than harm, dressed up as medicine. Yes, I will help you. Then I need you to keep accurate records of his improvement, no matter how small, And I need you to keep every letter, every request he has made of you. And I need you to say nothing to him of this conversation. You have my word." That night, Ilara sat once more beside her husband's bed, holding his hand, watching the candlelight flicker across his still face. She thought of the burned letter, of Mrs. Combs' careful evasions, of Dr. Rook's frightened confession, and felt the shape of the trap Percival was building around her husband, coming slowly into focus. She did not yet have enough to stop him completely, but she had enough to begin. "You are stronger than they believe," she whispered to Edmund, brushing a strand of dark hair from his forehead. "And so, I think, am I." In the bed beside her, unseen in the dim light, Edmund's fingers curled very slightly around the edge of the blanket, a small and private act of will that no one in the room was watching closely enough to notice. He had heard every word. Darkness was not silence, not for Edmund Ashworth. It was a strange and heavy weight pressing down on every limb, a thick fog that dulled his thoughts and slowed his body to something barely more responsive than stone. And yet beneath that fog, something in him remained sharp, awake, listening. He remembered the fall clearly enough, the horse rearing without warning, the ground rushing up too fast, the sickening crack of his skull against the low stone wall bordering the lower field. After that, there had been nothing for a long while. No sound, no light, no sense of his own body at all. He had simply existed in a formless dark, uncertain whether he was alive or dead or caught somewhere between the two. Then, slowly, sound had returned. Voices, distant and muffled at first, growing clearer as the days passed. He recognized his wife's voice before anything else, low and steady, speaking to him of small, ordinary things. The roses had bloomed early this year. The stable cat had given birth to 4 kittens beneath the hayloft. The weather had turned unseasonably warm. None of it mattered, and all of it mattered enormously, because it was proof that the world still existed beyond the fog, and that someone still believed he was somewhere inside it, waiting to return. He tried, in those early days, to answer her. He tried to open his eyes, to move his hand, to make any sound at all. Nothing obeyed him. His body remained a locked door, and he a prisoner rattling uselessly at the handle from the inside. It was Percival's voice that first cut through the fog with real clarity, sharp and cold in a way Edmund had never heard from his cousin before. He had always known Percival to be ambitious, a little too fond of London society, a little too resentful of the fact that Edmund had inherited the title and the estate while he himself had inherited only a modest income and a great deal of pride. But he had never suspected, not truly, that ambition could curdle into something as ugly as what he now heard in his cousin's voice through the bedroom wall. Someone must run this estate. It cannot simply sit untended. Edmund had wanted, in that moment, to rise from the bed and demand an explanation. He could not so much as twitch a finger. The days that followed brought a slow and painful education in exactly what his cousin intended. Fragments of conversation drifted to him through walls and half-open doors, orders given to the staff that were not his own. The careful, deliberate movement of Percival's belongings into the finest guest chambers, as though he were already settling into a permanent home. And beneath it all, the quiet, patient waiting of a man who believed the Duke of Dunmarch would never again be capable of objecting to anything at all. What Edmund could not understand, in those early days, was why his own body refused to obey him even as his mind grew clearer by the hour. He could hear now with perfect clarity. He could, if he concentrated with everything he had, feel the edges of his own fingers, the texture of the blanket beneath his palm. But when he tried to translate that awareness into motion, into the simple act of opening his eyes or curling his hand into a fist, the signal seemed to travel through mud, arriving weak and incomplete, if it arrived at all. Dr. Rook, during his examinations, sometimes murmured half to himself about swelling and pressure and the slow, uncertain process of healing within the skull. Edmund clung to those words. If the doctor believed recovery possible, however slow, then Edmund intended to prove him right, one small victory at a time. The first victory came on the night his wife whispered a promise to him in the dark, her voice trembling with an emotion she rarely allowed herself to show. "I will not let him take what is yours. Whatever it costs me, I will not let him take it." Something in Edmund's chest had tightened at those words, a fierce and sudden gratitude so strong it seemed to burn through the fog itself, and for the first time since the accident, he had felt his fingers move, only slightly, only for a moment. But it was motion, real motion, willed and achieved, and it told him something he desperately needed to know. He was coming back. He simply needed time, and he needed, more urgently than he had ever needed anything, for Alara not to be alone in the fight that was clearly building around them both. In the days that followed, Edmund began, in secret, to test the limits of his returning body. He worked at it slowly, patiently, always in the deep hours of the night when the house was quiet and no one sat watching him closely enough to notice small failures. A finger curled, a hand tightened faintly around the blanket. Once, briefly, his eyelids fluttered, though he did not yet trust himself to open them fully, not while Percival or Mrs. Combe might be somewhere nearby. He had begun, too, to understand something important about his own situation, something that turned his growing strength into a strategy, rather than simply a private struggle. If Percival believed him still lost, still incapable of understanding or acting, then Percival would continue speaking freely in the house, continue making the small mistakes of a man who believes no one is watching. And if Edmund revealed his recovery too soon, before Alara had gathered enough proof to expose the full extent of his cousin's scheme, Percival would simply retreat, cover his tracks, deny everything, and the truth might never fully surface. So Edmund made a decision. Difficult and strange as it was, he would remain still. He would let them believe him lost a while longer, would let his cousin's ambition run its course unchecked, gathering rope enough to hang himself with his own greed, and he would trust his wife, whose voice grew steadier and more determined by the day, to build the case that would bring the whole scheme crashing down. It was not an easy decision to hold to. There were moments, hearing Percival's voice growing bolder in the hallways, hearing new orders given to staff who should have answered to no one but Edmund himself, when the urge to simply open his eyes and put an end to it all became almost unbearable. But he thought of Alara's promise, of the steel he had heard beneath her careful, gentle voice, and he held himself still. One night, nearly 2 weeks after the accident, Dr. Rook came for his usual examination, and Edmund, listening as always, caught something new in the doctor's tone. A hesitation, a carefulness that had not been there before. "His pulse continues to strengthen," Dr. Rook said quietly, and Edmund could hear the faint scratch of a pen against paper, careful notes being taken. "I have observed movement in his hands on 2 occasions now, though brief. I believe, Your Grace, that his recovery may progress more quickly than either of us dared hope." "You will record all of this carefully," Alara said, her voice quiet but firm. "I will, Your Grace. Every observation, exactly as it occurs. You have my word." There was a pause, and then Dr. Rook spoke again, his voice dropping lower, as though he were confessing something that weighed heavily on him. "Your Grace, I must tell you, Lord Hale approached me again yesterday. He has raised the sum he is offering considerably. He grows impatient, I think. He mentioned a solicitor in London, ready to draw up guardianship papers the moment I provide the necessary declaration." Edmund felt fury rise in his chest, sharp and clean, cutting through the fog more effectively than anything had managed yet. "Did you give him any indication of your answer?" Alara asked. "I told him I required more time to be certain of my findings. It was not entirely a lie, Your Grace. I am simply certain of a different conclusion than the one he wishes me to reach." After Dr. Rook had gone, Alara remained beside the bed a long while, silent, and Edmund could hear the soft, uneven sound of her breathing, could imagine the exhaustion and fear she was carrying so carefully hidden from everyone else in the house. "I wish you could tell me what to do," she whispered eventually, so quietly he almost missed it. "I wish you could simply open your eyes and put an end to all of it." Edmund wished the same thing, more than she could know. But he thought of the letter Fairweather had found, half burned in the grate, of the missing sums in the estate accounts, of the solicitor waiting patiently in London for a doctor's signature that would hand his entire life's inheritance into his cousin's greedy hands. He thought of how easily, how completely, Percival might simply deny everything and disappear back to London if the trap sprung too soon, too incomplete. Not yet, he told himself, holding perfectly still beneath the blankets, his wife's hand warm around his own. Not yet. Let him believe he has won a little longer. Let him make his final, fatal mistake. Soon, he promised himself, and promised Alara too, though she could not hear the promise. Soon he would open his eyes, and he would make certain that when he did, there would be nothing left for Percival Hale to deny. The solicitor arrived from London on a grey, rain-soaked afternoon, and Alara knew the moment she saw his carriage roll up the drive that Percival had grown tired of waiting. She watched from the window of the upstairs study as a thin man in a dark coat stepped down from the carriage, a leather case clutched under one arm, and was greeted at the door by Percival himself, all smiles and outstretched hands, as though welcoming an old friend rather than a man come to steal a title. "Mr. Corbin," Percival said, his voice carrying up through the open window. "Thank you for making the journey so promptly. I trust the roads were not too troublesome." "Not at all, my lord. Shall we discuss the matter in your study?" Ilara did not wait to hear more. She hurried down the back stairs, her heart pounding, and found Simon Fairweather in the estate office, exactly where she expected him to be. "He has brought a solicitor," she said breathlessly. "From London. I believe he means to move forward with the guardianship papers, whether Dr. Rook cooperates or not." Fairweather's face tightened with alarm. "Surely he cannot proceed without the physician's declaration, Your Grace. The law requires medical confirmation of incapacity before any transfer of guardianship can be granted. He may believe he can find another physician willing to sign what Dr. Rook will not. Or he may simply intend to pressure Dr. Rook further, now that he has a solicitor present, to make the threat feel more real." Ilara pressed her fingers to her temples, forcing herself to think clearly despite the fear tightening in her chest. "We need proof before he finds a way around us. Real proof, not suspicion. Something no solicitor in London could argue away. The account records show clear irregularities, Your Grace. I have gathered as much as I safely could. It may not be enough on its own. We need the letters too, the ones Mrs. Combe has been delivering to him. If we can prove he has been planning this for months, that the accident merely gave him opportunity rather than reason, then no court in the land could grant him guardianship of anything." That evening, Ilara made a decision that frightened her even as she made it. She waited until the house had settled into its evening quiet, until she was certain Percival and his solicitor remained closeted together in the East Wing study, and she went, alone, to find Mrs. Combe. She found the housekeeper in the small sitting room off the kitchen, mending linens by candlelight, and closed the door behind her before speaking. "Mrs. Combe," she said, keeping her voice calm despite the pounding of her heart, "I know that you have been delivering more than ordinary post to Lord Hale these past months. I know that his instructions to the staff, given in my husband's name, were never actually given by my husband at all. And I believe you know precisely what he intends to do to this family." Mrs. Combe's hands went still over the linens. For a long moment she said nothing, and Ilara held her breath, uncertain whether she had just made a terrible mistake. "Your Grace," Mrs. Combe said finally, her voice unsteady, "I have served this family for 15 years. I did not wish to betray his grace. But Lord Hale made certain promises regarding my position, regarding my nephew's employment in London, should he come to control the estate. I am not a wealthy woman, my lady. I have very little else to depend upon. And now that you understand what he is truly attempting to do to a man who has never wronged you?" The housekeeper's composure finally cracked, tears gathering in her eyes. "I have kept the letters, Your Grace, all of them. I could not bring myself to burn them, though he instructed me to destroy anything incriminating. I think, somewhere inside myself, I always knew I might need them one day, to prove I had not truly wished any harm upon this house." She rose and went to a small locked drawer in her writing desk, retrieving a bundle of letters tied with plain string, and pressed them into Ilara's hands. "Thank you," Ilara whispered, her fingers trembling slightly as she took them. "Mrs. Combe, if you help me now, truly help me, I will see to it that no harm comes to you for what you have already done. You have my word as Duchess of Dunmarch." Mrs. Combe nodded, wiping at her eyes. "What would you have me do, Your Grace?" "Continue exactly as you have been. Deliver his post, follow his instructions, give him no reason to suspect anything has changed, but bring everything you learned directly to me, and only to me." That night, Ilara sat alone in her chamber with the bundle of letters spread across her desk, reading them by candlelight with growing horror and growing resolve in equal measure. They spanned nearly 8 months, long before the accident had ever occurred, and they revealed, in Percival's own careful handwriting, a plan built with patient and deliberate greed. Instructions to solicitors regarding guardianship law, inquiries about the process for declaring a peer incapacitated, correspondence with a moneylender in London regarding debts Percival had accumulated and desperately needed the Dunmarch estate income to settle. He had been planning this for the better part of a year. The accident had simply handed him the opportunity he had been quietly engineering all along. Ilara did not sleep. She spent the remaining hours of the night organizing the letters alongside Fairweather's account records, building a case so complete, so carefully documented, that no solicitor, no magistrate, no member of the House of Lords could dismiss it as the fevered imagination of a grieving wife. In the morning, exhausted but resolute, she went to check on her husband before facing whatever the day would bring, and found Dr. Rook already there, his face pale and shaken. "Your Grace," he said quietly, drawing her aside. "Lord Hale summoned me before dawn." He offered me a sum so large I confess I was momentarily tempted, God forgive me, simply from the shock of it. When I refused again, he grew angry. He told me plainly that if I would not sign the declaration, he would find another physician who would, and that my refusal would cost me every patient of standing in this county. And what did you tell him? I told him I would consider his offer overnight. Dr. Rook's jaw tightened. It was a lie, Your Grace. I have no intention of signing anything of the sort. But I needed time, and I needed him to believe I might still be persuaded, long enough for us to act first. Alara felt the pieces of her plan sharpening into something solid and real. Then we do not have much time left. No, Your Grace. I do not believe we do. She looked toward the bed where Edmund lay as still as he had lain for weeks, his chest rising and falling in slow, even breaths, his face peaceful in a way that gave no hint of the awareness Alara had begun, in recent days, to suspect might be hiding somewhere beneath his stillness. She had noticed small things, the faint movement of his fingers on nights when her fear grew loudest, a change in his breathing when Percival's voice carried too clearly through the walls. She did not know for certain. She could not know, not without proof any more solid than instinct and hope. But she found herself speaking to him now not merely for comfort, but as though he might truly be listening. I have the letters, she said softly, sitting beside him and taking his hand. Mrs. Combe gave them to me herself, along with Mr. Fairweather's records, and Dr. Rook's honest testimony. I believe we finally have enough to stop him completely. But Percival grows desperate, Edmund, and desperate men make dangerous choices. I do not know how much longer we can afford to wait. She thought, for just a moment, that his fingers tightened faintly around her own. It might have been her imagination, worn thin by exhaustion and fear. But it steadied her all the same, and she rose from the bed with new determination hardening in her chest. It was time to bring everything into the light, before Percival Hale found some new and desperate way to take what was never his to take. Alara spent the following 2 days moving through Dunmarch Hall like a woman balancing on a blade's edge, careful with every word, every glance, terrified that a single misstep might warn Percival that his plans had been discovered before she was ready to expose them completely. She met with Fairweather each night after the household had gone to sleep, the two of them working by candlelight to organize every piece of evidence into a case too solid to dismiss. The account ledgers, showing months of quietly stolen funds, the half-burned letter Fairweather's maid had discovered in the grate, the full bundle Mrs. Combe had preserved, revealing nearly a year of careful, deliberate scheming. And now, Dr. Rook's own testimony, which he had agreed, after much soul-searching, to put into writing and sign his name to. It is a great risk for him, Fairweather observed, watching Alara arrange the papers into a careful order. If Lord Hale learns of this before we are ready, the doctor's position in this county will be finished regardless of the outcome. I know, Alara said quietly. He knows it too, and still he has agreed to help us. I will not forget that, whatever else happens. On the second night, as she prepared to leave the estate office, Mrs. Combe appeared at the door, her face pale and urgent in the candlelight. Your Grace, you must come quickly. Lord Hale has sent for another physician, from a village 3 hours' ride from here. A man I have never heard spoken of before, and not favorably by those who have. I believe he means to have this new man examine his Grace tomorrow morning, and declare him incapacitated, whatever Dr. Rook refuses to sign. Alara's stomach dropped. Tomorrow morning? That is what I overheard, Your Grace. Lord Hale spoke of it with Mr. Corbin, the solicitor, not an hour ago. They mean to have the papers finalized within the week, once this new physician provides the declaration they require. Alara looked to Fairweather, and saw her own alarm mirrored on his weathered face. There was no more time for careful, patient gathering of proof. Whatever they had, however incomplete it might feel, would have to be enough, and it would have to be used tonight, before an unfamiliar physician arrived to sign away her husband's freedom on a stranger's false word. We confront him tonight, she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice, before this new physician ever sets foot in this house. Your Grace, forgive me, but is that wise? Lord Hale is not a man who will simply accept defeat quietly. There is no telling what he might do if cornered. I am aware of that, Mr. Fairweather, but I am done waiting for him to act first. Gather everyone who should witness this, Dr. Rook, Mrs. Combe, and yourself. I want Percival to stand before all of us at once, with no chance to twist the story to whoever arrives last. It took an hour to arrange, careful messages sent quietly through the house, candles lit in the great hall, chairs arranged as though for some ordinary evening gathering rather than the confrontation Alara knew was coming. She sent word to Percival and Cassandra that she wished to discuss matters of the estate before the new physician's arrival, phrasing it carefully enough that he would have no immediate reason for alarm. He arrived in the great hall looking faintly puzzled, Cassandra at his side, both of them dressed as though for an ordinary evening rather than anything unusual. "Alara," Percival said, glancing around at the gathered household with the first flicker of unease Alara had seen cross his face since the accident. "What is the meaning of this?" "I thought it best," Alara said, standing very straight, her voice carrying clearly across the hall, "that we discuss the future of this estate honestly, and in front of witnesses, rather than through whispered conversations in guest chambers and burned letters in the grate." The Percival's face went carefully blank, the mask he had worn so effortlessly for weeks beginning, at last, to strain at its edges. "I do not know what you mean." "I think you do." Alara stepped forward and laid the bundle of documents on the small table between them. "I have Mr. Fairweather's account records, showing the funds you have quietly moved from this estate for nearly a year, long before my husband's accident ever occurred. I have letters, in your own hand, discussing plans for guardianship and inquiries to a moneylender in London, regarding debts you desperately need this estate's income to settle. And I have Dr. Rook's own testimony, regarding the sums you have offered him, and the threats you have made against his position, should he refuse to declare my husband permanently incapacitated." Cassandra's composed expression cracked first, her eyes darting toward her husband with something close to panic. Percival, however, drew himself up with the last of his practiced calm. "These are serious accusations, Alara, built on nothing but stolen letters and the word of servants desperate to please whichever master pays them best. Do you truly believe any magistrate would take such a case seriously?" "I believe," Alara said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart, "that a magistrate would find it very interesting indeed that you summoned an unfamiliar physician from 3 hours away, a man with no established reputation in this county, specifically because the physician actually treating my husband refused to lie for you. I believe they would find it interesting that a solicitor arrived from London before any guardianship had been legally established, prepared already with documents waiting only for a signature. And I believe, Percival, that they would find it very interesting indeed to learn exactly how much money you owe, and to whom, and how conveniently my husband's accident arrived to solve your difficulties." "You have no proof of anything beyond suspicion and stolen correspondence," Percival snapped, his composure finally slipping entirely, his voice rising with something close to desperation. "I have done nothing but act as any responsible relation would, in the face of a tragedy that left this estate without proper leadership." "Is that what you call it?" Dr. Rook stepped forward now, his own voice trembling but resolute. "I have your offer in writing, my lord, your own hand, requesting that I falsify a medical declaration in exchange for payment. I did not seek you out to obtain it, you brought it to my door yourself." Percival's face drained of color as Dr. Rook produced a folded letter from his coat, holding it out for all in the hall to see, though he did not release it from his own grip. "This is absurd," Percival said, though his voice had lost the confidence it carried only moments before. "A misunderstanding, nothing more. I merely wished to ensure the physician's diligence was properly rewarded, given the difficulty of the case." "Then explain the moneylender's letters," Alara said quietly. "Explain why you require this estate's income so urgently that you were willing to see my husband declared incapacitated, whether the truth supported such a declaration or not. Explain, if you can, precisely what price you believed his silence was worth to you." The great hall fell utterly silent. Every servant and witness gathered along its edges watching Percival Hale's carefully constructed composure crumble entirely beneath the weight of his own greed laid bare before them all. It was into that silence that a new voice spoke, low and rough from disuse, but unmistakably clear. "I believe," said the Duke of Dunmarch, standing unsteadily in the doorway of the great hall, one hand braced against the frame, his eyes open and sharp and fixed directly on his cousin's stricken face, "that my wife has already named the price rather precisely." The gasp that swept through the hall was immediate and total. Cassandra's teacup, forgotten in her trembling hand, slipped and shattered against the floor. Percival staggered backward as though struck, his mouth working uselessly, no sound emerging at all. Alara turned, her own breath catching painfully in her throat, and found her husband's eyes fixed not on his cousin, but on her, filled with a fierce and unmistakable pride that steadied her more completely than anything else in that long and terrible night had managed to do. He had heard everything. He had been listening, all along, exactly as she had begun, in her deepest instincts, to hope. "Edmund," she breathed, moving toward him, as Fairweather rushed forward to help steady his weakened legs. "I am here," he said quietly, his voice still rough, still weak, but growing stronger with every word. I have been here longer than any of you realized, and I have heard more than enough. For a long moment, no one in the great hall moved. The servants along the walls stood frozen in disbelief, staring at the Duke of Dunmarch standing upright in the doorway, pale and unsteady, but undeniably awake, undeniably aware, undeniably alive, in a way none of them had dared hope for in weeks. Percival was the first to recover his voice, though it emerged thin and strangled. "Edmund. You are well, thank heaven. We feared the very worst." "Did you?" Edmund's voice, though rough, carried a cold precision that silenced whatever else his cousin might have said. "I confess I heard very little fear in your voice these past weeks, Percival. A great deal of planning, a great deal of ambition, very little fear at all. You cannot possibly believe I wished you harm." "I believe," Edmund said, moving slowly but steadily further into the hall, Fairweather's steadying hand beneath his arm, "that I have lain in that bed for nearly 3 weeks, unable to move, unable to speak, and entirely, painfully able to hear every word spoken within these walls. I heard you tell Cassandra that someone must run this estate, and that the someone should be you. I heard you pressure Dr. Rook to falsify my condition. I heard you summon a stranger's physician to accomplish what an honest man refused to do. I have heard, cousin, every single thing I needed to hear." The color had entirely drained from Percival's face now, leaving him gray and shaking. His earlier bravado collapsed entirely beneath the weight of a truth he could no longer deny or twist away. "Edmund, please, whatever you believe you heard, surely we can discuss this privately, as family." "We are discussing it now," Edmund said, "in front of the very witnesses whose testimony you attempted to buy or silence. I find that rather more fitting than any private conversation could ever be." Alara stepped forward then, standing beside her husband, the bundle of evidence still resting on the table between them and Percival. "You asked me, only moments ago, what price I believed your silence was worth. I think it only fair that you understand precisely what that price will now become. Mr. Fairweather has documented every stolen sum, going back nearly a year. Dr. Rook has your written offer, in your own hand. Mrs. Combe has preserved every letter you believe destroyed. And now my husband himself stands as living witness to your intentions, spoken freely in these very halls, believing him incapable of ever repeating them." "You would ruin your own family," Percival said, his voice cracking with something between anger and desperation, "over money you never needed, and a title that was never truly at risk." "I would see justice done," Edmund said quietly, "for a crime that very nearly succeeded, cousin, whatever else you wish to call it. You did not merely wait for misfortune to hand you an opportunity. You planned for it. You pressured a good man to betray his oath. You attempted to buy the loyalty of my own household against me. And when that failed, you sought to bring in a stranger willing to lie for coin, rather than accept the honest word of a physician who knew me and refused to betray his conscience." Cassandra, who had remained silent throughout, her face a mask of growing horror, finally found her voice, thin and pleading. "Percival, tell them it is not true. Tell them there has been some terrible misunderstanding." But Percival said nothing at all, and his silence, in that crowded hall, spoke louder than any denial could have managed. It was Simon Fairweather who finally broke the heavy quiet, stepping forward with quiet authority. "Your Grace, given the evidence gathered, I believe it falls to you to decide how this matter should proceed. The magistrate in the county town would take a considerable interest in these documents, should you wish to pursue formal charges." Edmund looked at his cousin for a long moment, weighing something Alara could not entirely read in his expression. Whatever fury burned beneath his still weakened exterior, there was something else there too, something almost sorrowful. The look of a man mourning a family bond he had once valued, more than he had realized, until it was proven worthless. "I will not see you dragged before a magistrate, Percival," he said finally, and Alara heard the barely restrained relief in Cassandra's shaking breath. "Not for my own sake. For the sake of whatever remains of our family's name, which you have already damaged quite enough without a public trial to finish the work." "Edmund, thank you. I am not finished." Edmund's voice hardened again, cutting off whatever gratitude Percival had begun to offer. "You will leave Dunmarch tonight, and you will not return. Any debts you owe are entirely your own concern from this moment forward, and you will find no further assistance from this family in settling them. Every sum you have taken from this estate will be repaid in full, through whatever means necessary, or I will reconsider my decision regarding the magistrate entirely, and you will never again set foot on any property belonging to this family, for as long as either of us shall live." Percival's jaw worked silently for a moment, some final protest dying unspoken on his lips as he seemed to recognize, at last, that no argument remaining to him would soften his cousin's resolve. "As you wish," he said finally, his voice hollow, all pretense of warmth or familiarity entirely gone. "Cassandra, gather our things. We leave within the hour." They departed before midnight, their carriage rattling away down the long drive into the darkness, and Alara stood at the window of the great hall watching its lamps grow small and distant, feeling something in her chest finally, cautiously, begin to unclench after weeks of carrying a weight she had not fully allowed herself to acknowledge until this very moment. "It is over," she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else in the room. "Not quite," Edmund said from behind her, and she turned to find him lowering himself carefully into a chair by the fire, his strength clearly not yet fully returned despite the fierce resolve that had carried him through the confrontation. "There remains the matter of thanking everyone in this house who protected me and this family when I could do nothing to protect myself." He looked first to Dr. Rook, who stood quietly near the door, looking somewhat overwhelmed by the events of the evening. "You risked your reputation, and very possibly your livelihood, to refuse a lie that would have been easier, and considerably more profitable, to simply tell. I will not forget that. I only did what any honest physician should have done, Your Grace." "Many would not have," Edmund said simply. "You will find your position here, and your standing in this county, considerably more secure than you might currently believe." He turned next to Mrs. Combe, who stood near the back of the hall, twisting her apron nervously between her hands. "You made a difficult choice, and a mistake, in trusting my cousin's promises over your loyalty to this house. But you corrected that mistake when it mattered most, and at real risk to yourself. That matters a great deal to me." "Thank you, Your Grace," she whispered, tears gathering once more in her eyes, though these seemed born of relief rather than fear. Finally he looked to Fairweather, who had served this family faithfully for 2 decades and more. "You have my gratitude, as always, though I suspect you already knew that without my saying it aloud. It has been my honor, Your Grace, as it always has been." When the hall had finally emptied, the servants dispersing to their beds, Dr. Rook departing with instructions to return in the morning to properly assess the Duke's continuing recovery, Alara found herself alone with her husband for the first time since he had spoken his first words in the doorway. She knelt beside his chair and took his hand, the same hand she had held through so many long and frightened nights, and found it warm and steady now, gripping her own with real strength. "You heard everything," she said quietly. "All of it. Every night I sat beside you, every fear I confessed when I believed you could not hear me. Every word," Edmund confirmed, his voice gentler now than it had been all evening, exhaustion and tenderness mingling openly in his expression. "I heard your promise, that first terrible night, and I held on to it through every day that followed. You gave me a reason to keep fighting my way back, Alara, when my own body seemed entirely determined to keep me lost. I did not know if you could hear me at all. I simply could not stop speaking to you. It felt like the only thing I could still do for you." "It was everything," he said simply. "It was more than you know." She rested her head against his hand, exhaustion finally catching up with weeks of fear and vigilance and careful, desperate planning, and felt him gently stroke her hair with fingers that, only days before, could not move at all. "I am proud of you," he said quietly, "for what you built while I could do nothing but listen. You did not simply wait for rescue, Alara. You built the very thing that saved us both." Outside, the last traces of Percival's carriage lamps had long since vanished into the darkness of the drive, and within the walls of Dunmarch Hall, for the first time in many long weeks, a quiet and genuine peace began, slowly and carefully, to settle over the house once more. Recovery, Dr. Rook explained in the weeks that followed, would not be swift, but it would be steady. And steady, Edmund decided, was more than enough after weeks of believing steadiness might never return to him at all. He regained the full use of his limbs slowly, first learning to walk the length of his bedchamber leaning on Fairweather's arm, then the length of the corridor, and finally, on a bright morning nearly 2 months after the accident, the full distance of the garden path where Alara had so often walked alone during the darkest days of his silence. News of Percival's disgrace spread through the county with the particular speed such stories always seemed to travel, whispered first among servants and tradesmen, then more openly among the families who had once welcomed him at their tables. He did not return to London society with any ease. The debts he owed, once his access to the Dunmarch estate had been permanently severed, caught up with him within the year, and Edmund heard, second-hand and without any particular satisfaction, that he and Cassandra had retreated to a small property in the north, far from the circles they had once hoped to command. Edmund found he did not think of his cousin often. Once the initial anger had faded into something quieter and more settled, there was too much else to occupy his thoughts. The estate required careful attention after months of neglect and quiet theft, and he threw himself into restoring it with Fairweather's steady guidance, correcting the small damages Percival's mismanagement had caused, rebuilding the trust of tenants and staff who had watched the house teeter so close to disaster. Mrs. Combe remained in her position as housekeeper, her earlier lapse never spoken of again within the walls of Dunmarch Hall, her loyalty in the months that followed proving steady and unwavering, in a way that quietly repaid whatever trust Edmund and Alara had extended to her that difficult night. Dr. Rook's practice grew rather than suffered, as word spread through the county of a physician who had refused a fortune rather than betray his conscience, and families from villages Edmund had never previously heard of began seeking him out specifically for his evident integrity. It was Alara, though, who occupied the greatest share of Edmund's thoughts as the months passed and his strength fully returned. He found himself watching her sometimes across the dinner table, or in the quiet hours of the evening when she read beside the fire, remembering the steadiness of her voice through all those long, uncertain nights, the fierce and careful intelligence with which she had built, piece by piece, the case that ultimately saved them both. "You never once faltered," he told her one evening, several months after Percival's departure, as they walked together through the garden in the fading autumn light. "Through everything, you never once let him see you afraid." "I was terrified the entire time," Alara admitted, smiling faintly at the memory. "I simply could not afford to show it. I kept thinking, if I faltered even once, if I gave him any reason to doubt me, he would find some way to use it against us." "You were remarkable," Edmund said simply. "I lay in that bed for weeks, entirely unable to help you, and you never once needed my help at all. You did it yourself, Alara, every difficult piece of it." "I had help," she reminded him gently. "Mr. Fairweather, Dr. Rook, even Mrs. Combe in the end, however reluctantly she came to it. You gathered them," Edmund said. "You saw clearly what needed doing, and you found the courage to do it, even when the doing of it might have cost you everything if it had gone wrong. That courage was entirely your own." She said nothing for a long moment, simply walking beside him in the cool evening air, her arm linked through his. The estate spread quiet and peaceful around them in the fading light. It was difficult, even now, to fully believe how close they had come to losing everything, how narrowly the truth had emerged before Percival's careful scheme could be completed beyond any hope of undoing. "I think," she said finally, "that I have never been more frightened, nor more certain of anything, than I was that night in the great hall, laying everything out before him, and praying it would be enough." "It was more than enough," Edmund said. "It was everything." They walked on together in comfortable silence, the last light fading gently over Dunmarch Hall, and Edmund found himself grateful, in a way he suspected he would carry with him for the rest of his life, that he had lain still and listened long enough to understand exactly what his wife was capable of, and exactly how deeply he could trust her, not merely with his heart, but with everything he possessed. The estate prospered in the years that followed, its accounts carefully tended, its tenants well cared for, its household staff loyal and steady in a way that spoke of the trust rebuilt so carefully after those difficult weeks. And though the memory of Percival's betrayal never entirely faded, it settled, eventually, into something more like a lesson learned than an open wound, a reminder of exactly what they had both been willing to risk for one another, and exactly what they had, together, proven capable of protecting.